is called Veterans History Project. The Veterans History Project helps collect, as well as preserve, the stories of American veterans so that future generations can hear directly from the people who have served our country. These are actually videos, so you can hear as well as see. The sacrifices of the men and women in uniform should never be forgotten. Their stories help us to better understand the cost of freedom and the service that has helped keep our country safe and free and strong. Today, I will be delivering for the 9th year the stories of 6 more Iowa veterans to the Library of Congress as part of this project. These veterans come from communities across Iowa and represent different branches of military service. This year, the Army, Navy, Air National Guard, and Army National Guard. Their service includes different periods and experiences, even including service during Operation Desert Storm. These records bring the total number of records that I've submitted for the Library of Congress Veteran History Project to well over 100. These additional stories will now be preserved at the Library of Congress, where they can help future generations better understand the roles our veterans have played in defending our freedoms. I'm glad that these Iowa stories will be part of such an important project. I yield.
Mr. President.
Senate Majority Leader is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Americans are pretty used to presenting their photo IDs. These days, you need one for just about everything you do. Driving a car, you better have your license on you. Starting a new job, you'll need to show a photo ID. Want to be an emergency snow shoveler in New York City, you need to bring 2 forms of ID for that. Mr. President, you need a photo ID to open a bank account or visit your doctor. You can ask for a photo ID before you get on a plane or check into a hotel. You need to have your ID ready to buy an alcoholic drink or to go into an R-rated movie. So it's safe to say Americans are taking their IDs out on a regular basis and having a pretty easy go of it. Yet when it comes to voting, Democrats talk like requiring a photo ID is some kind of an insurmountable burden. And that really doesn't make sense. As I said, most Americans are taking out their IDs on a regular basis, and for things that are a lot less important than voting. In the city of Washington, D.C., for example, you need to show a photo ID anytime you go to use a city rec center. Yes, if you're in a basketball league or trying to swim a few laps in the pool, you need to show an ID here in Washington, D.C. But you can vote in this city. Perhaps in that very rec center without showing a photo ID. Mr. President, how does that make any sense? There's a very clear difference between using a city facility and casting a vote to determine how your city or federal government is run. And logically speaking, doesn't it make sense that our elections should at least be as secure as the local rec center? I think so. And the American people seem to think so too. Poll after poll shows that the American people support voter ID. Yet despite years of Democrat fear-mongering about the implications of requiring a photo ID to vote, the American people view voter ID as just common sense. North of 80% of Americans in a poll last year said they support requiring all voters to show a photo ID at the polls. An NBC News headline this week reads, and I quote, "Most Americans support requiring photo ID to vote. Democrats in Congress reject it," end quote. Well, that's pretty much it, Mr. President. Requiring a photo ID to vote is something that's so common sense, only congressional Democrats could oppose it. And I would really like to know their reasoning. Of course, Democrats are now hedging, suggesting that they do kind of support voter ID. Well, if they do, it would certainly be news to me. As I said, for years, Democrats have acted like asking for a photo ID would be an intolerable burden to place on voters. When he was a senator, Barack Obama opposed a national voter ID amendment saying that it was an attempt, and I quote, to restrict the approach for people voting throughout the country, end quote. As vice president, later as president, Joe Biden decried state laws that required voter ID. And a few years ago, and this one really baffles me, then Vice President Kamala Harris said, and I quote, "I don't think we should underestimate what voter ID laws could mean, because in some people's mind, that means you're going to have to Xerox or photocopy your ID to send it in to prove who you are." Well, there are a whole lot of people, especially people who live in rural communities, who don't. There's no Kinkos, there's no Office Max near them, end quote. That was from then Vice President Kamala Harris. Well, Mr. President, I spent a good amount of time in rural South Dakota. And I'm happy to share that people in rural areas do in fact have photo IDs and regularly use them. And they'd be more than happy to show them at the polls. In fact, under South Dakota law, voters already have to show a photo ID to cast a ballot. And the former vice president will be happy to know that copy machines have also made it to rural America. Mr. President, despite Democrats' fear-mongering, requiring a photo ID is not some sort of an impossible thing to ask of voters. And I think Democrats actually know this. A photo ID was required to get into the Democrat National Convention in 2024. Vice President Harris required an ID to get into her campaign events. The senior Democrat senator from Georgia required photo ID to get into his recent rally. Mr. President, the other day, the junior senator from Oregon said that the Save America Act is, quote, about stopping groups from voting who tend to vote for Democrats, end quote. Well, if that were true, why would Democrats be requiring a photo ID for their voters to get into their campaign events? Needless to say, it's not true, Mr. President. Requiring a photo ID to vote is just common sense. And it's not that hard. You need a photo ID to see a doctor, stay at a hotel, start a job. It's not too much to ask to require it when you go in to vote. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks.
Mr. President,
Senator, Senator from Wyoming is recognized.
thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, in today's Democrat Party, common sense is not very common. Photo ID requirements are the definition of common sense. You need an ID to buy a beer. You need an ID to board a plane, to cash a check, as you do in so much of American life. Why would you not need one to cast a vote in an election? The Save America Act simply says you need to be a citizen of the United States to register to vote, and you need to show a photo ID in order to vote. Plain and simple. This is in no way controversial, unless, of course, you're a Senate Democrat. Because this week, every Senate Democrat, every Democrat who is a member of this body has now been put on the record right in this very chamber. Republicans support photo ID. Every Democrat in this chamber voted against it. And that includes Senator Schumer, the minority leader in the Senate. And apparently, Senator Schumer was for it before he is now against it. Because 30 years ago, Congressman Chuck Schumer of New York, he was a champion of photo ID. He stood on the floor of the United States House of Representatives and he argued to the body that IDs are necessary, and they were necessary to stop illegal immigrants from receiving welfare. He was for it before he's against it. Because today, the same Senator Schumer from New York has called photo IDs fringe. He did it right here at that podium on Monday afternoon. Mr. President, did he change his beliefs, or did his party change their demands? The minority leader is not alone. There is actually a video, and it's worth watching, of President Barack Obama. He was voting in his re-election in 2012. He was going to vote. Can you guess what the video shows? Well, let me tell you. The video shows President Barack Obama presenting his photo ID in order to vote. He was President of the United States. He was on the ballot. He was probably the best-known person in the entire world at the time. And even President Barack Obama had to prove who he was when he showed up to vote. Democrats are completely two-faced on this, Mr. President, because just recently, one of our Democrat colleagues, a senator from the state of Georgia, demanded voters show photo IDs if they wanted to attend one of his political rallies. So you need to show a photo ID to get in his rally, but you don't need to show a photo ID in order to vote. Oh, no. Two-faced, double standard, not common sense, out of touch with the American people. The mayor of New York City, and he is, of course, the face of today's Democrat Party, he is an avowed socialist. He admits it out loud. He told New Yorkers they wanted to help shovel snow in the city during the storm. You need to bring not one, but two forms of ID to prove who you were. You need an ID to get welfare, to attend a Democrat campaign rally in Georgia, or to shovel snow in New York City. You should absolutely need to show a photo ID if you want to vote in an election in America. Photo ID is a norm in democracies all around the world, Mr. President. All but one country in Europe requires a government-issued photo ID in order to vote. 36 states in America, including Wyoming, my home state, requires voters to present an ID when arriving at the polls. Can't be what Senator Schumer called fringe. It can't be a fringe to adopt a common practice in America, in 36 states, and around the world. That's what Chuck Schumer and the Democrats think is fringe. So why do Democrats continue to oppose the Save America Act? What is it that they're trying to protect? Yesterday, I spoke on this floor about the mess in the state of Oregon. Oregon hands out driver's license to illegal immigrants. Easy to get. In Oregon, a driver's license comes with automatic voter registration. You get a driver's license, you're of age, you're automatically registered to vote in the state of Oregon. As a result, from 2021 through 2024, hundreds of illegal immigrants were given driver's licenses and then automatically added onto Oregon's voter rolls. People are astonished when they hear this. Oregon is still scrambling to try to clean up the mess. When Americans hear stories like this, they lose faith in our elections and our system. The real voter suppression threat is not photo ID, but it's Americans losing trust in our elections. That's what we need to be concerned about, Mr. President. They lose trust when they learn that illegal immigrants are on the voter rolls, are being allowed to vote. Photo IDs restore the trust that our system needs. It reduces fraud, and it sends a simple message. It sends the message that your vote matters and that elections are decided by your fellow citizens, not by illegal immigrants. Democrats protect their own campaign rallies with ID requirements, yet they encourage voting without IDs. Why do our elections deserve any less scrutiny than Democrats' own campaign events? Not a single Democrat will come to this floor and explain that to the American people. Tell us why. That's what I would say to the Democrats. Come to the floor and tell us why you need a photo ID to get into your events, but you don't need one to vote. Every American should support elections that are fair, secure, and transparent. The Save America Act makes photo ID the law of the land, and it is the best way to ensure that our elections reflect the will of the American people. It is, by every measure, common sense. And that's exactly why every Democrat in this chamber voted against it. Now, Mr. President, on a separate matter, today the Department of Homeland Security remains closed. It has been shut down by the Democrats for over a month. The Democrats shut it down. Now they want to peel it apart, and they refuse to reopen it. Remember, the Department of Homeland Security was put into place after the terrorist attacks of 9/11 of 2001. It was established as a comprehensive program to protect our nation's security. The Democrats want to peel it apart. As they're playing their political games, people are suffering. We're seeing long lines, security lines at airports, thousands and thousands of TSA employees missing paychecks, and at the same time there have been multiple terrorist attacks on American soil. Here's what one Democrat member told Axios this week. He said, "We're making people hurt." Oh, I bet he's real proud of that. That's a Democrat answer. We're making people hurt. Apparently, this is what the Democrats want to pitch their voters on. We're making people hurt. It's much worse than that. The Democrats have blood on their hands. Today, Democrats have blood on their hands. Democrats continue to prioritize illegal immigrant criminals over American citizens. It's been going on a long time, and it continues today, and that's why they're holding hostage the Department of Homeland Security. I want every American to know why this is happening, because for more than a month, Republicans have tried to negotiate with Democrats, all aimed at reopening the Department of Homeland Security so we could have a secure America. But in spite of good faith efforts by the White House, and they've outlined and laid out a long offer, the Democrats continue to say, no, stay closed. The offer addresses mutual concerns in areas of cooperation. It includes IDs on the officers, body cameras. At the same time, the proposal protects the ability of law enforcement officers to uphold our immigration laws. Remember the laws that Biden ignored and had 10 million illegal immigrants flooded into our country over the 4 years that the Democrats were in charge here and Biden was in the White House, and the criminals that came with him? That's what the Democrats want to protect. Those are the people that the Democrats are focused on, the illegal immigrant criminals, rather than the safety and security of the American people. We come up with reasonable offers, and the Democrats have responded first with silence, then with spin, but not once have they come up with solutions. This is a basic betrayal and a blatant betrayal of the responsibility that all elected officials have to protect the American people. The Democrats are way off base. Let me tell you what this means. In Georgia, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, which trains federal law enforcement officers in over 100 different agencies, it's shut down right now. In Nevada, a field office for the Homeland Security Investigation Unit that combats fentanyl and other drugs, it is unfunded. In Washington State, major upgrades for the Coast Guard at the Seattle Polar Security Cutter Home Port, they're on delay. None of this makes America stronger. None of this makes America safer. It makes America weaker. It is time to fully fund the Department of Homeland Security. The American people know that the Democrats are the ones standing in the way of their own personal safety. It's time for Democrats to get on board and fund the Department of Homeland Security. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
The Senate Minority Leader is recognized.
Well, Mr. President, Donald Trump promised an easy and quick war with Iran. He promised overwhelming victory. 3 weeks later in Iran, just the opposite of what Trump promised is happening. Last night, a stunning report in the Washington Post revealed that the Pentagon has reportedly discussed with the White House requesting $200 billion from Congress to bankroll Donald Trump's war with Iran. $200 billion so Donald Trump can go to war with Iran is preposterous, unacceptable. Even a fraction of that is unacceptable for a war without a plan, without a goal, without the support of the American people. Let's be very clear. If Trump wants $200 billion, that means he believes we might be in a war with Iran for a very, very long time. $200 billion is more than what we spent even at the height of the war in Iraq. It's more than we have spent altogether in Ukraine. It's an indefensible number, one of the most wasteful and unthought out budget requests I have ever heard in my time in the Senate. For $200 billion, we could lower health care premiums for tens of millions of Americans. For $200 billion, we could educate a generation and unleash the immense potential of our students. For $200 billion, we could cut hunger in this country in half or more for many years. For $200 billion, we could invest in jobs, in science, in manufacturing. We could begin fixing our power grid. But instead, the Trump administration reportedly wants $200 billion to go to war with Iran. It is unacceptable. It is ridiculous. It is beyond the pale. Such a large amount of money for a war that no one knows the goal, no one knows the conclusion, no one knows the path. That changes, Trump changes all of these things, the goal, the path, the cost, every day. And he wants us to spend all this money? And meanwhile, the consequences of Trump's war are mounting every hour. I hope America will look at this chart. In 4 weeks, gas prices have surged by 27% here at home. It is the second largest 4-week jump in 35 years, the second largest jump in 35 years. And Donald Trump doesn't care. Here's what Trump said about this huge increase, plus 27% in gas prices. He said, "They're not bad. I thought it would be worse." Well, if you're a billionaire, you don't care. If you're a billionaire, you don't think such a large increase every time you pull up at the pump isn't bad. Tell that, Donald Trump, to the people paying $4 a gallon. And then look at what Kevin Hassett, Donald Trump's top economic advisor, said on live television. He said, "Americans' pain is the least of our concerns." What an outrage. Hassett, take that back, because it sure is one of the biggest concerns of the American people. The least of our concerns right now? What kind of bubble are they living in when the average American has to figure out how to pay for gas to get to work or pay for lunch? America, every time you fill up the tank, know this: Donald Trump and his advisors don't care that you're hurting. It is the least of their concerns. They do not care that Trump's war is taking money out of your pocket. They do not care that rising gas prices are making it harder to pay rent, pay for groceries, pay for health care. They do not care. Shameful, disgraceful, cold-hearted, and so out of touch. But it doesn't stop there. This morning, Reuters reported that Donald Trump is thinking about deploying thousands more troops to the Middle East as the Pentagon prepares for the next stage of the war. You know what that sounds like to most Americans, what Trump said? It sounds like Trump is getting closer and closer to putting boots on the ground. It sounds like Donald Trump is thinking of expanding this war, mission creep on a massive scale. It seems like an oxymoron, mission creep on a massive scale, but they're creeping and creeping and creeping every day and bungling us into war. Boots on the ground, of course, will inevitably mean a surge in casualties, a surge in costs, a surge in chaos. That's not what the American people want, and Republicans know it. They know this war goes against the wishes of the American people, and they refuse. Republicans here in the Senate refuse to stand up to Trump, even though they know the war is wrong, wasteful, putting lives at risk. Last night, we gave Republicans another chance to assert Congress's constitutional authority to tell Donald Trump he cannot drag this country into war without authorization. Once again, Republicans opposed it when they opposed Senator Booker's motion. Where's their courage? Where's their loyalty to the Constitution? Where are the public hearings with Secretaries Rubio and Hegseth under oath? You want to spend $200 billion and you don't want to even let your cabinet people show up at hearings to answer questions? What an outrage. Americans' pain is the least of our concerns. You hear that, America? At $4 gas, Americans' pain is the least of our concerns. This is not the end of the matter in the Senate. This issue ain't going away. Republicans can try to wash their hands of Donald Trump's war with Iran, but they will not escape responsibility. The American people and Democrats will hold Republicans accountable for willingly supporting Donald Trump's reckless, aimless, chaotic war in Iran. On the SAVE Act, Republicans want to waste yet another day on a radical piece of legislation that hardly anyone outside the MAGA fringe even cares about, the SAVE Act. Democrats' position has not changed. If Republicans want to waste the Senate's time debating this bill, so be it. We will continue to debate it. That's what the rules allow the senators and Senator Thune to do. We'll continue, but we will continue to expose just how radical and ugly it is. That's what Democrats will do, over and over again. The longer the SAVE Act stays before the Senate, the more obvious it becomes it's not a voter ID bill, it's a voter suppression bill, it's a voter purge bill. The SAVE Act says no more vote by mail, no more driver's licenses to register, no registering online or on campus or at church. Republicans want to pass through the eye of a needle. Republicans want to make Americans pass through the eye of a needle just to exercise your fundamental right to vote. The SAVE Act would force every state in America to send its voter rolls to the Department of Homeland Security, an agency that has nothing to do with administering elections and everything to do with Musk and DOJ and incompetence at the top. Those voter rolls would then be screened by an algorithm designed by Musk and DOJ to supposedly root out non-citizens from the rolls. But in reality, it could kick millions of American citizens off the voter rolls, just like it kicked off many American citizens when a screening was tested in Missouri. Now, MAGA Republicans keep talking about the SAVE Act in terms of protecting elections. This is a load of nonsense. Kristi Noem was more honest. She said it was about Kristi Noem said the SAVE Act was about making sure only the right people get to vote. The right people get to vote. So anyone who thinks this is just some benign effort to tell the small number of illegal immigrants, make sure they're not on the rolls, no one disagrees with that. Oh no, it's an effort to make the right people to get the vote. Who are the right people according to Republicans and Donald Trump? Well, the SAVE Act gives us some clues. Deep in the SAVE Act, there is one blanket exception for the SAVE Act's draconian restrictions. Only one. One exception. Guess what it is? It's for the state of North Dakota. North Dakota's ruby red. It's overwhelmingly Republican. And it's the only state that right now does not require any form of voter registration. So it gets a free pass from all the rules every other state would have to follow. How convenient. And look, MAGA claims of voter fraud are utter garbage, but according to the ultra-right Heritage Foundation, North Dakota had 12 instances of improper voting. 12's not a lot, it's tiny. But it was still more than other states that would be forced to impose draconian barriers to vote. North Dakota gets a pass again. How convenient. It's almost as if the goal of the SAVE Act has nothing to do with securing elections. This is how you write a bill designed to give Republicans a naked partisan advantage, and it is what the SAVE Act does. It's not a voter ID bill, it's a voter suppression bill. And finally, on TSA and ICE. Today, this afternoon, Democrats will be giving Republicans another chance to do the right thing by TSA workers and pay them for the important work they do, while we continue to debate how to address issues at ICE. Democrats have maintained the same position for weeks. We need to rein in ICE and stop the violence, and the American people are on our side. Rather than negotiate common sense reforms, Republicans have stonewalled funding, held critical agencies like TSA hostage. We Democrats don't want to do that. Republicans, we're willing to fund ICE now. Just don't stand in the way, support us, and TSA agents will be funded. Or rather, we're willing to fund TSA now. Now. No ands, ifs, or buts. Last night, Warnock went to the floor to offer a UC to pay our TSA workers. For the fourth time, Republicans blocked the bill. Today, Senator Slotkin will try it again and give Republicans another chance to fund TSA right away, shorten the lines at the airport, and bring the chaos to an end. The only question Republicans must answer today is this: Has enough been enough? Will they finally fund TSA or keep holding those workers and our travelers hostage? Yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the House message with respect to S. 1383, which the clerk will report.
House message to accompany S. 1383, an act to establish the Veterans Advisory Committee on Equal Access and for other purposes.
Senator from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. President, this past weekend marked 61 years since President Lyndon B. Johnson delivered his "We Shall Overcome" speech to a joint session of Congress. Speaking from the House rostrum in the wake of Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama, President Johnson urged Congress to pass legislation that would secure, quote, "the full blessings of American life to all, regardless of color or creed." That Congress would heed his call. On August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. That bill, nearly a century after the ratification of the 15th Amendment, would finally outlaw discriminatory practices that erected unjust barriers to voting for African Americans, like literacy tests, poll taxes. It would open the ballot box in America to everyone. 6 decades later, another president would speak from that same rostrum, this time at his State of the Union address. And that president insisted that Congress passed a bill that would make it more difficult, would make it harder for eligible citizens to vote. How far we have fallen from Lyndon B. Johnson's noble goal. We have not overcome. With this SAVE Act, we are still trapped in bigotry. Earlier this week, at President Trump's request, the Senate began consideration of the Save America Act in a marathon debate session. Why? Because President Trump is throwing a temper tantrum, demanding that Congress pass his legislation and nothing else. I have long said in politics there is always a good reason and a real reason. The good reason the president touts when arguing in favor of his bill, that it supposedly puts safeguards to prevent voter fraud. Nobody wants to see voter fraud. That's a good reason, isn't it? But here's the truth. Federal law already prohibits citizens from voting in federal elections, non-citizens from voting in federal elections, and cases of non-citizens voting are extremely rare. In 2024, the Bipartisan Policy Center decided to figure out how frequently we encounter voter fraud in American elections. The Conservative Heritage Foundation election fraud database found in the period 1999 to 2023, 24 years, how many cases do you think they found of voter fraud? Incidents where non-citizens successfully cast ballots. Out of the millions and millions of votes that were cast, they found exactly 77 in a 24-year period. 77. Barely more than 3 per election cycle. And you say to yourself, where is the voter fraud that is leading the Republicans now to create new obstacles for voters to face if they want to register to vote? What's the real reason then? If there aren't only 77 cases of voter fraud in 24 years, I'll tell you, it's for MAGA Republicans to cling to power by rigging the elections in November. It was the same motive when it came to creating new congressional districts for Republicans. This president is scared to death of what's going to happen when the American people finally get to say the last word on his policies. And so he wants to change the election rules. Hard to imagine. He's very blatant about it. They're not hiding it. The lead sponsor of the bill, the senior senator from Utah, said this weekend, and I quote, "Republicans will lose power likely for a long time if we don't get Save America passed. Unless we change the rules on registering and voting, even though there's little or no evidence of fraud and abuse, this Republican senator who's leading the charge concedes the obvious. It'll hurt them in the next election if they fail to pass this bill. They don't think they can win the election fair and square, so they need to change the rules and make it harder for eligible voters. So what's in this Republican political life raft that's on the floor? Among the provisions is one that requires all states to obtain proof of citizenship in person. Two critical words, in person, from people looking to register to vote. In their bill, a driver's license, the most common form of identification in America, and most real IDs, would not be enough to register to vote. You need more. You've got to prove your citizenship before you can register under the Republican plan. Only birth certificates, passports, similar documentation would count. Well, let's go through those. How many Americans actually know where their original birth certificate can be found? And how about those who have a birth certificate with the maiden name of a woman who's married or in a hyphenated relationship? What are you going to do with those documents? And do you know how many Americans don't have a passport? Almost half of the people living in America have no passport. Half of the population. You say to yourself, well, go get a passport. There can't be much to it. Have you tried lately? You know what it costs? $165. So before you get to vote, you got to write a check for a passport for $165. That applies to 146 million Americans. And how long does it take? Well, I can tell you the people work hard to get out the millions of passports each year, but we're talking about 3 or 4 weeks, in some cases months. If you put an extra $60 on it, make it $225, they'll expedite it. That's your poll tax. You want to vote? You want to register? You got a passport? If you don't, get ready to fork over $165 to over $200 for a passport. And when you consider how long you have to wait, how long you have to wait for the opportunity to have this passport, maybe you're not doing it in time for this election. That's the Republican plan. Make it more bureaucratic and more cumbersome and more confusing, despite the fact there is little or no evidence of voter fraud in the United States. What this amounts to is a modern-day poll tax for a passport. This bill would also unfairly impact married women who've taken on their spouses' names. They either have to amend their original proof of citizenship documents or go through paperwork and a bureaucracy to register to vote. You're going to hear from my Republican colleagues about how this bill has been updated to accommodate people that don't have the required documentation. But the fact remains, unnecessary barriers are being put in place to block access to the ballot for no apparent reason. 77 cases of voter fraud in 24 years. Is that a national scandal? Is that a national crisis? Of course not. Here's the good news. At this moment, my Republican colleagues in the Senate don't have the votes to pass the bill. So now the question is, will the majority leader throw out the Senate rules and bend to the president's pressure? I certainly hope not. If we truly believe, as President Johnson said, that we must not refuse to protect the right of every American to vote in every election that we participate in, then we must reject this terrible legislation which will deny the right to vote to eligible voters across the United States. The Save America Act is an affront to the fundamental right to vote, and I'll be voting no. I yield the floor.
President.
Senior Senator from Kentucky is recognized.
As Republican leader, I always enjoyed calling our colleagues' attention to longtime Senate staff as they notched milestones of service in our institution. Well, today, I'd like to reflect for a few moments on a longtime advisor who's an institution in his own right. There have been any number of occasions over the past several decades when it would have been right and fitting to praise the talents and service of Paul Grove. There's certainly been no shortage of situations where, except for the efforts of this one man, the Senate might have missed opportunities to advance America's influence on the world stage. The longtime Republican clerk at the Appropriations Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations is quite literally that good. But Paul, like so many of the brightest unelected members of the Senate family, is also good at dodging credit for his extraordinary service to the Senate and to our country. Well, not this time. Tomorrow will mark a cumulative 30 years of Senate service for Paul, 25 of them consecutively. He's got more Senate experience than 96 of our elected colleagues. And as his first Senate boss, I'm invoking my right to say a few words about it. Long before Paul Grove was the Senate's resident expert on the levers of American soft power and our trusted emissary to the furthest corners of Southeast Asia and even beyond, he was a junior legislative aide to a freshman senator. And if memory serves, I initially paid him to advise me on, believe it or not, health care policy. In that sense, Paul's career resembles many Capitol Hill success stories. Show up with intelligence, a good work ethic, and let the rest of it sort itself out. But with due respect to the many thousands of smart and hardworking staff who walk these halls, Paul Grove's engine runs on an even rarer fuel, a deep, sincere, and abiding belief that the task before him was good and worthy of his best. My fellow appropriators understand that when folks complain about how the sausage is made here in Washington, they're referring to us and the complex ways that we try to keep the lights on around here. But if you're ever tempted to think it's all a bunch of grizzled paper pushers and number crunchers untethered to the real world, I would encourage you to spend some time with Paul Grove. My good friend Robin Cleveland, who preceded Paul at the subcommittee, described him as a true believer. That's dead right. He's a true believer in the dividends of American leadership, the power of our influence, and the prospects of democracy, even in places where it seems to be on the ropes. Perhaps that's why the only thing ever pulled Paul away from the Senate and our important role in shaping American foreign policy was the chance to go even closer to the front lines. By the time Paul returned from several years in Cambodia, where he supported fledgling democracy movements across Southeast Asia, he was the obvious choice to help me lead the subcommittee. And while no one could fill Robin's shoes, Paul brought his own, and they fit perfectly. His approach, certainly less profane, but no less fortunate and formidable. Ask anyone from the State Department who's dealt with Paul whether it's worth trying to dodge his pointed inquiries. During my time as chairman, Paul and I crisscrossed the world together. And I learned the hard way that Paul's approach to trip planning could have made even our late friend, the intrepid John McCain, think twice. On my first CODEL, to Iraq and Afghanistan with Paul. He had us wake up in Pakistan, attend briefings and lunch in Afghanistan, refuel in Oman, and have dinner in Turkey. Paul may have been the only one still awake during that dinner. And I tried to institute a maximum 2 countries per day rule after that. In capitals and far-flung outposts alike, Paul's devotion to our mission made me smarter and more effective. And I'm sure my successors at the subcommittee, Judd Gregg and now Chairman Lindsey Graham, know the feeling. No doubt, so did full committee leaders like Ted Stevens and Thad Cochran and Richard Shelby, and now Susan Collins. When I look back on this chapter of our work together, I'm particularly grateful for Paul's focus on a cause that's come to mean a great deal to both of us, the pro-democracy movement in Burma. As the old saying goes, success has 1,000 fathers. Needless to say, Washington hasn't exactly jumped to claim credit for the modest progress of Burma, brave champion of democracy. Like our dear friend Aung San Suu Kyi, who sits today in house arrest under the thumb of a military junta. And yet for friends of the people of Burma, Paul Grove has been a constant presence, scrutinized every development, pressing successive administrations towards sensible U.S. policy that counters PRC influence and holds the military junta to account. And tending the embers of hope for people who have faced far more than their fair share of hardship. Paul has been to the bottom of seemingly intractable challenges across the globe, but never lost sight of America's interest in resolving them. He became a master of using the power of the purse to compel transparency, extract justice for Americans, reward dedicated partners in oil, or sometimes replace squeaky gears in the machine of soft power. Frankly, to the extent that America has had more responsible friends and capable allies in the fight against terrorism, or communism, or authoritarianism, it's been in no small part due to Paul's dogged efforts. So, Mr. President, I've been fortunate to get have the opportunity to hire a lot of very smart and dedicated young patriots during my time here in the Senate. Very rarely have I managed to draw on their talents for as long as I've been able to learn and lean on Paul Grove. So today, with 30 years under his belt, it's a good time to say thank you, Paul.
Senator from Vermont is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. President, at a time when our country faces unprecedented crises, the United States Senate has spent an entire week debating a problem that essentially does not exist. The goal of the SAVE Act that is on the floor right now is to make certain that non-citizens do not vote in American elections. I don't know that anyone disagrees with that. And the good news is that non-citizens do not vote in American elections. Study after study has shown that the number of undocumented immigrants voting in American elections is virtually non-existent. We are debating a problem that does not exist. The Conservative Heritage Foundation found that over a recent 24-year period, 24 years, there have been a grand total of 77 confirmed instances of undocumented immigrants voting in the United States. 24 years, 77 undocumented immigrants voting. Hundreds of millions of people voted in a 24-year period, and there were 77 instances of non-citizens voting. That is according to the Conservative Heritage Foundation. What about individual states who have looked at this issue? What have they found? Well, the state of Utah found that of the state's 2.1 million registered voters in 2025 and 2026, a grand total, all right, here we go, a grand total of one non-citizen registered to vote in that state, and that individual never cast a ballot. 2.1 million registered voters in Utah, no non-citizens registered to vote. 2024, Idaho reviewed its 1 million registered voters and found 36 possible non-citizens registered to vote. 2024, Georgia, state of Georgia ordered its 8.2 million registered voters and found 20 non-citizens registered to vote. Overall, not only are there a tiny number of people undocumented who are registered to vote, most of those citizens have never even voted. They just registered to vote for whatever reason and were properly removed from the voter rolls. Let us be clear. Federal law already prohibits non-citizens from voting in federal elections, and no state, not one of our 50 states, allows non-citizens to vote in state elections. But, Mr. President, if this legislation were to be passed, it would create a whole lot more problems than it would solve. Under this bill, every American would be required to have a passport or a birth certificate in order to register to vote. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, as many as 69 million married women have last names that do not match their birth certificates and would need to provide additional documentation proving their name change in order to register to vote. Further, an estimated 4 million Americans have had their birth certificate or other necessary documents stolen or destroyed. If you're watching this out there, just think, do you have a birth certificate? How are you going to get a birth certificate? How many weeks, months? How much does it cost? You're going to have to go through all the bureaucracy to get your birth certificate. Even worse, want a passport to vote? Well, half of Americans, 146 million people, don't have a valid passport. Those who would need a passport to vote under this bill would have to spend $130 to renew a passport or $165 for a new one. And by the way, you're going to have to wait up to 6 weeks to get it. So, make no mistake about it. This legislation is nothing more than a modern-day poll tax that would deprive millions of low-income, working-class Americans from being able to vote. So what is this bill really about? Well, good news is President Trump has told us what it's about. Trump has said that if this legislation were signed into law, Republicans would, quote, never lose a race. For 50 years, we won't lose a race, end of quote. Well, my understanding of election reform would be to make sure that the United States made it possible for more people to participate in the political process, make sure that we had one of the highest levels of voter participation rather than one of the lower rates of voter turnout in the world. In other words, we want to strengthen our democracy, not throw millions of people off the voting rolls, so, to quote President Trump, Republicans would never lose a race. Mr. President, instead of spending a week on a non-existent problem, maybe it's time we started to focus on some of the enormous crises facing our country. And let me just take a moment to mention a few. Never before in American history have so few individuals had so much wealth and so much power. During the Gilded Age in this country with Rockefeller and Carnegie, you had a handful of people who had enormous wealth and enormous power. Nothing compared to what exists today. Today we have more income and wealth inequality than we have ever had in the history of this country. Think that might be an issue that we should be talking about? Do you think we might be suggesting that there is something wrong when the top 1% in America now own more wealth than the bottom 93%? Do you think we might be talking about making some changes in an economic system in where 60% of our people today are living paycheck to paycheck, families struggling to feed their kids, pay for health care, pay for rent, pay for child care, pay for the basic necessities of life? 60% of our people live in paycheck to paycheck, and one guy, Elon Musk, owns more wealth than the bottom 53% of American households. Think maybe that might be an issue that we should be talking about? But, Mr. President, one of the reasons we don't talk about that issue and many other vital issues that impact working families is the reality that Congress today is much more concerned about protecting the needs of its campaign contributors, the billionaires who are putting an unprecedented amount of money into the political process, rather than representing the needs of working families throughout America. No great secret. As a result of this disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision, the billionaires in this country, Democrats, but more Republicans, putting huge amounts of money into the political process. And the Congress is quickly becoming a corporately owned entity. Maybe we might want to talk about how we get rid of big money in politics and create a democracy in which every person has one vote, not where billionaires can spend unlimited amounts of money to elect candidates who represent their interests. And I should tell you, Mr. President, that one way I believe that we begin to tackle the massive level of income and wealth inequality that exists is by imposing a wealth tax on the 938 billionaires in America who are worth some $8.2 trillion. Legislation that I have proposed, the wealth tax on billionaires, would not impact anybody in America who is not a billionaire. But over a 10-year period, this legislation would raise $4.4 trillion, strictly from the people on top, the 1/10 of 1%, minuscule number of people who are doing unbelievably well. And what would we use that $4.4 trillion for? Well, let me just briefly tell you. For a start, in the first year, at a time when working class families are struggling to put food on the table and pay their rent, this legislation would provide every man, woman, and child in the country in a household making $150,000 or less a $3,000 direct payment, $12,000 for a family of four. So at a time when the billionaires have never had it so good, when many of them are paying virtually nothing in taxes, we're going to demand that they start paying their fair share so that working class, low-income families can get some help $3,000 for every man, woman, and child in families of less than 150,000. This legislation would end homelessness in America and address the affordable housing crisis by building 7 million units of low-income and affordable homes and apartments. 20 million households in America should not be forced to spend half of their limited incomes on housing. We should not have 800,000 people sleeping out on the streets. Instead of giving tax breaks to billionaires, we should be building low-income and affordable housing. This bill would expand Medicare. In Vermont and all over this country, you got elderly people, can't afford dental care, can't afford hearing aids, can't afford vision care. This legislation would expand Medicare to cover dental, vision, and hearing. Last poll that I saw on that, only 90% of the American people supported it. Maybe we may want to pass it. This legislation would provide universal child care in America and make sure that no one in our country pays more than 7% of their limited incomes on child care. At a time when school districts in Vermont and around the country are having a hard time attracting good teachers because the pay scale is much too low, we would make sure that no teacher in America earns less than $60,000 a year. This legislation would also make sure that seniors and people with disabilities receive the home health care they need through Medicaid. And by the way, this legislation would prevent 15 million Americans from losing health care by repealing Trump's $1.1 trillion cut to Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. And we do all of that just by asking the very wealthiest people in this country, the fewer than 1,000 billionaires, to pay 5% of their wealth in taxes. And you know, after that, I know people, editorial writers all over America, very worried about what happens to poor Mr. Musk and Mr. Bezos and Mr. Zuckerberg. The good news is they will still have enough money with their hundreds of billions of dollars left to feed their families. I don't want anybody to think that the Musk family or the Bezos family will go hungry. We leave them with hundreds of billions of dollars. And the other thing, Mr. President, that we got to do, instead of dealing with non-existent problems like the SAVE Act, we got to address the threat of artificial intelligence and robotics. And surprise, surprise, our very same friends, Mr. Musk, Mr. Bezos, Mr. Zuckerberg, Mr. Ellison, Mr. Thiel, and others are pouring huge amounts of money into AI and robotics. Left unchecked, these technologies will bring about a massive transformation of American economic, political, and social life. That's what we're talking about. And that transformation of American life, economic, political, social, is being pushed by a handful of multi-billionaires. And it is time for the United States Congress to say, slow it down. And it's not only what it will do to throwing millions of workers off of their jobs, hooking children to artificial intelligence. I've talked to a number of scientists who believe that we're not talking about science fiction anymore, in the sense that if AI continues to develop and become smarter than humans, the truth is AI may become independent of human control and threaten the very existence of humanity. Now, I know that the future of humanity and the existence of whether or not we survive, not quite as important as dealing with legislation dealing with a non-existent problem like undocumented people voting. But maybe, just maybe, we might want to spend a few minutes determining whether or not we should slow down AI so that humanity survives, so that tens of millions of people do not lose their jobs, so that kids do not lose their mental health by becoming addicted to AI, etc. So bottom line, Mr. President, there are enormous issues facing this country. It is no great secret that the American people increasingly understand that the work of this Congress right now is to protect the 1% and wealthy campaign contributors. And maybe it's time we started worrying about working families and ordinary Americans. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Ohio is recognized.
So I actually would like to continue exactly the theme that my colleague from Vermont brought up. Except I think before we talk about artificial intelligence, we should talk about natural intelligence. And it absolutely goes against natural intelligence for us to sit here in this chamber knowing that we have 260,000 working American families who work for our government, who are doing their job and not getting paid. That, to me, is the crisis we should be talking about. And yes, I agree with my colleague from Vermont. We should not be worried about Mr. Musk or any of the other billionaires going hungry. I worry about our TSA agents going hungry. I worry about our Coast Guard people going hungry. I worry about the people at FEMA going hungry. And yet, with total disregard for over 250,000 families, we sit in this chamber and we're getting paid. Everybody here is getting paid, and yet they're not. And I applaud my colleague from Vermont who's walking out of the floor, caring about working Americans. Why don't we care about them? Why don't we fund DHS now? Why don't we worry about those families who, by the way, according to the last Secretary of Homeland Security, the last one said, and I'm going to quote here, the average TSA agent lives paycheck to paycheck. We've taken away 3 paychecks. 3 paychecks we've taken away from them. If there's ever a time that we need to fund DHS, it's now. This is not a Republican secretary saying that. It's a Democrat Secretary of Homeland Security saying that. I don't understand how in a leadership role, which is what we are here in the United States Senate, we would allow the suffering of 260,000 families to go with this much contempt and instead fund DHS in its entirety. Allow those families to get paid. Mr. President, you were a business guy like I was. Could you ever look at yourself in the mirror when you owned your businesses and know because of your actions the people who worked for you weren't getting paid and were suffering? It's impossible. I remember when I started my first business, I felt the weight of success because I had to take care of my family. But those early families for that first business that I bought, every day I walked in, I felt this incredible responsibility. Like, man, if I made bad decisions, like if I make a bad decision today, people will go hungry who work for me. And that drove me to succeed. We are totally disconnected here. We sit here in this chamber, it doesn't even touch any of us. And I think that's a disgrace. I think we should very simply do what's always been done before we became this hyper-partisan chamber. We fund the government responsibly. And then, if we have policy disagreements, we can sit down. By the way, right now, just down this hallway, there's Democrat colleagues and Republican colleagues of good faith sitting down to negotiate differences to get the Department of Homeland Security funded. We have American citizens that are paying taxes to fund a government to work that is not working. I know that sometimes pleading with my colleagues to have some level of humanity is ineffective, because quite frankly, maybe this place takes a little humanity away from you. Maybe you don't see how these decisions affect many, many people. So with that, Mr. President, I'm going to ask a very, very, very simple request. Very simple. I'm going to ask unanimous consent that this body, the United States Senate, proceed to immediate consideration of calendar number 156, H.R. 4553. I further ask that the substitute amendment at the desk be considered and agreed to, the bill as amended be considered and read a third time and passed, and that the motions to be considered be made and laid upon the table. And what this means in English to the person who may be watching is this funds the entire Department of Homeland Security for 2 weeks. Everybody gets paid up to date. We get the department open, and then let the work that's being done now proceed. I ask that that happen.
Is there an objection? Senator from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. President, I object. And I think Look, all of us here understand, because we travel twice a week, what TSA is going through. That's why we should immediately today fully fund TSA. If you care about paying TSA, let's pay TSA today. Oh, I'm sorry. I object. If we want to actually pay TSA, let's do it right now. My colleague from Ohio, we both know what it's like to go back and forth to the Midwest every single week. Want to fund TSA? Want to have humanity for the people who are securing us? Let's fully fund them today.
So I'm not sure.
Senator from Ohio.
Sorry, Mr. President, sorry about that. I'm not sure what I just heard, because I just offered to fund TSA. I just offered to fund the Coast Guard, FEMA, Customs and Border Patrol, Secret Service, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers, USCIS, Homeland Security Investigations. So let's do it for 2 weeks. Let's do that for 2 weeks. Down the hall, there are senators of good faith that are getting together to end this political charade. So to my colleague, I will yield the floor for a simple question. Why would you want to fund just TSA and not the Coast Guard? Not, for example, in your state, the American Immigration Council is that deals with 102,700 undocumented immigrants in Michigan. Why wouldn't you want enforcement around that? Why wouldn't you want to fund the department that allows people like me, who when I was 18 years old applied for citizenship? Why wouldn't we want to fund 3,300 employees, some of them in your state, that actually process legal immigrants? Like, why wouldn't we fund that? Why wouldn't we fund 7,000 special agents that are there to stop transnational criminals? Why wouldn't we fund 200 employees that fund, and you were a CIA agent, that fund biological nuclear threat prevention? Why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we fund 60,000 employees at Customs? You care a lot about the bridge that was hopefully due to be opened from Canada. You need Border Patrol agents there. You need Customs there. Why wouldn't we fund that? Why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we do that for 2 weeks? 2 weeks. And then we can get together. Why wouldn't we do that? Why just fund one narrow slice of the Department of Homeland Security? I'm just curious why you would do that.
Will the senator yield? So here's the thing. I think
Michigan's recognized.
I'm sorry, pardon me. I think it is not hard to notice that right now our country is going through a pretty fundamental conversation about the role of ICE and law enforcement in our city streets. We know that it's a cultural conversation in the United States of America because the previous Secretary of Homeland Security got fired because of the disaster that went on in Minneapolis. I sat, as you did, in the hearing with Markwayne Mullin yesterday because we need a new Secretary of Homeland Security. Every American in the world, Democrat and Republican, understands that's because ICE so deeply contradicted American values in our American cities. So we're having a full-on cultural conversation about the role of law enforcement in our streets. In the meantime, you and I can agree every day of the week on the role of Border Patrol, CBP, FEMA, which we desperately need, Coast Guard, which no one has more Coast Guard pretty much than Michigan. So I'm ready to fund those things now. But I don't think we can ignore the fact that ICE is right now an unsettled issue in the United States of America. We're not settled. People are negotiating because we're not settled. And even this week, the President of the United States sent a letter down here to talk about the reforms he acknowledges we need in some form or fashion. Now, some of those reforms to me are like basic and don't go far enough, like we won't deport American citizens. But even the president acknowledges we have a problem with ICE. So let's excise that one part that we are having an American conversation on and then fully fund the other stuff here and now today. That's what I'm proposing.
Will you yield for a question?
Of course.
Thank you. Look, I appreciate, and I know you're a person of good character, by the way. I genuinely believe that. But that's not what you're asking for. You're asking to fund just TSA. But meaning the question is this. why would we use 260,000 people and their families as pawns in a negotiation? Why wouldn't we pay all those people? So will you consider adding a bill that I've put together that says that as long as we haven't fully funded the government, we get money taken out of our paychecks, not held in suspension, that we actually would lose compensation, about $500 a day, every day that goes by where we haven't fully funded the government. Would you consider adding that to your resolution?
Will you yield?
You have the floor.
Sorry, I don't know the rules here, but, sorry, Mr. Speaker, if you have to.
The Senator from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you. So first of
President
all,
is enjoying this debate.
I am proposing today just the UC on TSA, but my colleagues, one after another, have proposed funding the Coast Guard, Border Patrol, FEMA. So whichever way we want to do the package, individually or all but ICE, I'm here for it. And I'll do you one better on your proposal. I 100% agree. When I first came into Congress in 2019, we were in a government shutdown in the first Trump administration, right? President Trump had a shutdown. That's how I came into Congress. And my very first bill as a congressperson, bipartisan, by the way, the Problem Solvers Caucus, a bunch of us did it, was that if the government isn't fully funded, then Congress people, A, do not get paid, and B, I'll go one further, are not allowed to have government pay for their travel back home, meaning they have to sit their butts down in Washington and negotiate and get it done then and there without taking taxpayer dollars to go back home. So whether you want to add a $500 fee, whatever it is, this body is for appropriating money. So I'm here for whatever you want to propose. But I think you have to acknowledge, even the president acknowledges at this point, that the American public, Democrat, Independent, and Republican, does not like American citizens being killed in our streets. They do not like going into a human being's home without a judicial warrant. They don't like children being taken and tear gassed and caught in the crossfire. Non-well-trained officers pulling people out of cars and getting into dangerous situations. People being targeted. You should hate this. When you're walking into Target, they had ICE officers pulling people aside because they looked like they were immigrants and checking their papers. You know what that does to a Jew? You know what that means to just check people's papers because of how they look? You should hate that. So for me, whether we agree or disagree, and I would hope we'd agree on the use of force in America, set that aside, fund everything else today, now, here, penalize members of the Senate who want to go home and ignore the problem. I'm with you on that. But you are holding all of those agencies hostage because of ICE. You are defending them and not allowing them to get their paycheck. You are holding them back from those 3 paychecks, not Democrats. We are here ready to pay. You are so protective of ICE, so protective of this president that you will not fund the other parts of DHS, and that is our Homeland Security. I know about that. That is my entire life. You know, you care about that. I know you do, Senator. So please, just excise the thing we're not agreeing on, fund the rest of it, let's get on with it, and understand that the American public have made their voice clear on this issue.
We yield for...
Senator from Ohio is recognized.
So, Homeland Investigations is part of ICE. It's 7,000 special agents that work for ICE that stop transnational criminals. You're not suggesting that we not fund them, are you?
I am suggesting that we get everybody in a room, sorry, if I can yield, that we get everyone in a room on Homelands, on the ICE issue. Lock them in a room here in the Capitol, our negotiators. I need the president to send his envoy so we can actually make some decisions. It has been hard to negotiate with Senate Republicans on this issue because they need the blessing of the White House. Get all the players in a room. We will sit down. I'll do it. I'll be here all day and all night, all weekend. But I got to tell you, you can't use one group of people as a shield to not fund all the other border missions, all the other funding of the FEMA. You can't do it.
So one more question, with your permission. So nobody on your side has agreed to fund USCIS. You have not suggested that. USCIS is an independent part of the Department of Homeland Security. That has not been suggested by any Democrat. I appreciate that you are. Nobody has agreed to fund the Bioweapons of Mass Destruction Agency, not been suggested. And you've specifically, meaning not you personally, the Democrat senators have specifically said they do not want to fund customs, which you understand really well, what customs means, and border protection. Like that, these agencies that are listed on this board, there's been no movement among Democrats to fund this. And this is why my point is the same. I'm not suggesting to my colleague from Michigan at all that we permanently fund this forever. What I'm saying is 2 weeks. Let's reopen the Department of Homeland Security for 2 weeks. Let's let people of good faith, you and I, look, we agree on what you said. Let's take our paychecks away. Let's prevent us from flying home. Let's make us, I'll use your words, keep our butts here until we get this done. If that means today, tomorrow, Saturday, Sunday, we can play pickleball in between, it'll be fantastic, okay? But we don't leave. If that means right through Easter, by the way, we do not leave this chamber. And we do not get, and we lose pay every day that goes by until we've funded the whole thing, because we can work it out. We can work this out. But I look at some of your colleagues who said they're serene as to where we are on this. I don't think there's 260,000 families that are serene about this, and I don't think you are either. So again, I would just ask that you amend your resolution to say, let's fund the entire department for 2 weeks. We don't want to defund ICE. I'm not hearing you say that. I hear some of your other colleagues say that, but we're not looking to defund ICE, and we're certainly not going to stop Homeland investigations. Let's fund the whole thing for 2 weeks. Let's get the American people to understand we can get things done. Let's not absolutely leave, forget DC, let's not leave this chamber, the Capitol, until we get this done. That's my ask, that's my plea.
Senator from Michigan.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Calendar 362 S4127, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President?
Senator from Ohio is recognized.
Reserving my right to object, just to be clear what was just proposed. What was just proposed is to fund just TSA. Nothing else. Nothing else. And what's wrong with that, in case you didn't hear the peanut gallery, what's wrong with that is that there's hundreds of thousands of other government employees who, for no fault of their own, they did nothing wrong. They didn't do anything to do with what happened in Minneapolis. No role in that whatsoever. They go to work every day, doing the best they can to keep us safe. Mr. President, yesterday, for the first time in my life, I attended a dignified transfer ceremony in Dover. I'm thinking to myself, these 3 Ohioans, what did they die for? They died to preserve freedom for us. They didn't ask any questions. They went willingly. They volunteered. Can we honor their sacrifice by saying, do the right thing? Fund the Department of Homeland Security for 2 weeks. Senators, stay here without pay, not held pay, docked pay, because we haven't done our job. Article 1, we are the power of the purse. So I would ask one last time before concluding this. Can I get my colleague from Michigan, who's a good person, to agree to amend her proposal to fund the entire Department of Homeland Security for 2 weeks, and then force every senator, and I think that she has the influence to convince her colleagues to stay here without pay until this gets done.
Is there objection to the request?
Yeah.
I repeat, is there an objection to the request?
Yes.
I object.
The objection is heard. Is there an objection to the original request?
I, with a broken heart, object. And we did not do the right thing for the American people today, Mr. President. It's a shame. Politics got in the way of helping working Americans. It's a disgrace.
The objection is heard. Senator from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. I want to talk a little bit about the SAVE Act. Now, despite its name, SAVE Act's not going to help you or anyone in America save on anything. It won't help you save on your gas bill, your medicine, your rent. It won't help you save on student loans or child care, what you pay for your utilities. This bill has nothing to do with money at all, and it certainly isn't about helping Americans. We're going to fight against this bill with everything we've got, and it will fail because it's bad for the country. And that's right. The Republicans know the bill will fail, and they are intent on dragging this out for hours, for days, that could be spent addressing the real issues that Americans face. The cost of gas is rising every day, week after week. In parts of Colorado, the price of gasoline has almost doubled in the last several weeks. That's money taken straight out of your pockets. Grocery prices are going up. Doctors' visits are going up. Housing costs are going up as well. Right now, 1 in 3 American households spend more than 30% of their income on housing, 1/3. And when they're not shelling out for rent, they're shelling out more for health care. Despite living in the wealthiest country in the world, Americans pay the highest cost for health care globally, and in many cases get worse results. But we don't have to tell all of America this. We don't have to tell all of you this. You already know it. You're living it every single day. At the checkout line, in the pharmacy, the doctor's office, when you pay your electric or water bill. And here's what makes it work. You're doing everything right. You're working longer hours, picking up second jobs. You're cutting back in every way you can to make ends meet. You're skipping vacations. You're delaying buying a home. You're putting off starting a family. Some folks today are even skipping doses of medication just to stretch their prescription a few more days. This is not because you want to, but because you have no choice. You see no other way. A year ago, at his inauguration, our president promised lower prices and no more foreign wars. This administration has already spent $20 billion of your dollars waging war on Iran. And the war has gotten bigger, bloodier, and more expensive every day since. Just today, the Pentagon announced their plan to ask Congress for $200 billion to fund the war in Iran. $200 billion. That's money that we don't have. Our deficit last year was somewhere in the vicinity of $1.75 trillion. And yet, Congress is going to be asked to borrow $200 billion more, add that to the national debt. The SAVE Act isn't going to save any of that. It's not going to save any American any money. And it certainly isn't going to change reality. So what is it really about? I think it's about saving this administration's failing agenda. And how is that? It's through voter suppression. The president knows that costs are high. He knows that you're angry. He knows that the majority of Americans disapprove of the war, are unhappy that their costs keep rising. But instead of actually lowering prices, he's backing a bill that's going to make it harder for most people to vote, especially for Americans who he doesn't trust will vote for him. The Save America Act creates mountains of red tape for voters and will ultimately remove millions of Americans from the voting rolls, Republicans, Democrats, Independents. It requires every voter
to dig through their basement, go up into their attic, and try to find their birth certificate, right? Find their passport, just so they can register to vote, something most of them have been doing year after year for decades. But there are problems, real problems, with this plan. More than 21 million Americans, 21 million American citizens, don't have their original birth certificate handy, or they don't have a passport. They don't have either one of these types of identification. And 69 million married women have birth certificates that don't have their correct last name. They changed their name when they got married. Taken together, the Save America Act would make it more difficult for tens of millions of people to vote. It would also dismantle vote by mail as we know it. Now, about 1 in 3 Americans voted by mail in 2024, an election that President Trump won. During the 2024 election, the voters most likely to vote by mail were those over the age of 65. It's the single best way for folks with limited mobility to exercise their constitutional right. Just look at Colorado. Almost 99% of Republican voters in Colorado voted by mail in 2025. Now, way back in 2013, when I was still the governor, we passed a set of laws that established our state as the gold standard for secure and accessible elections. We started by making voting as accessible as possible. We established one of the first universal vote-by-mail systems in the country. Now, you can still vote in person, but every single Coloradan gets a ballot mailed to them. Now, these reforms were largely created by Republican county clerks working with our Republican Secretary of State. Vote by mail has proven to be less expensive, more secure, and people love it. The turnout just goes up. It's perhaps the single most effective way to increase voter turnout. Today, as I said, every single registered voter gets a ballot in the mail. Every ballot that they receive in the mail is printed on paper, meaning that we have a physical record across the entire voting system that can be easily audited, even the faintest hint of fraud. And we go beyond that. I mean, it is basic common sense. The ballot arrives weeks before the election, gives Coloradans plenty of time to research the candidates, talk around the kitchen table who they think is going to do the best job, and submit their ballot by mail or go drop it off at a ballot box. And even if voters wait until the last minute, they can still register to vote and vote on Election Day. Now, Colorado Republicans were behind this initiative literally every step of the way, because this was about making voting, the act of voting, making that easier for everyone. Coloradans, Democrats, Republicans, independents, we have almost a third, actually we have more than a third independents now. Everybody loves this system. During the 2025 election, 98% of all the Coloradans who voted by mail. They submitted mail-in ballots. They dropped it off or they put it in the mail. And Coloradans didn't just make voting accessible, we made it secure. We created a multi-layered system of checks and balances. Every single ballot, every single drop box that receives ballots is under 24-hour video surveillance from the time the box opens for ballot return until the end of an election, day and night. We made sure Coloradans could track their ballot the same way you would use FedEx or UPS to track a package, so voters could trust that their ballot had been counted. And in 2017, under the leadership of Republican Secretary of State Wayne Williams, Colorado took election security to the next level. We became the first state in the nation to conduct a bipartisan statewide audit after every election. And results from these audits over the last 6 years show that Colorado's vote counting systems were more than 99.99% accurate. We put the burden on a team of Democratic and Republican leaders to use the state's resources, in other words, the state pays for this, to ensure that every person who votes is eligible and every vote counted matches the ballot. Now, the SAVE Act would completely reverse this progress. It would bog down the voter in endless mountains of new red tape. And in the end, millions of Americans wouldn't cast a ballot at all. Now think about and ask yourself who this really impacts. Seniors who no longer drive, rural Americans who live hours from a government office. These are likely Republican voters, but it's going to impact them negatively. It will impact working parents who can't take time off to track down paperwork or take work off to vote in person. It would impact women whose last names have changed, as I mentioned. At the end of the day, none of it helps you, the voter. It's all a distraction, a rather large distraction. I mean, every hour that we're spending in the debate about the Save America Act is an hour we're not spending bringing down the cost of groceries or housing, health care. While Americans are worried and continue to worry, and they are worried, while Americans are worried about costs, they're worried about their families and their future, the administration is relitigating the 2020 election and waging a war most Americans don't want. All of this chaos, from Colorado to Venezuela to Iran to Minnesota, it's one big distraction from this administration's failure to lower costs for Americans. The bill was never about saving Americans money. They call it the SAVE Act. It creates a misrepresentation. But what we should be here today to accomplish is to figure out how to save money for the Americans, American people, for all of you. If your agenda is working and you're delivering on promises, you don't have to make it harder for people to vote. I would argue that agenda might not be working. I think the results, if your agenda is working, and the people speak for themselves. So let me spell it out. Americans want lower costs. Not wars abroad, not violence in the streets. Americans are looking literally for any sign that this administration still sees them, still sees the rising grocery costs, the gas prices, the huge bill increases from doctors' offices. Excuse me. This administration refuses to acknowledge these problems exist. And there's so much infighting within the president's ranks that they can't decide whether this war will go on for 2 weeks or 5 weeks or a year. Are American troops going to be deployed? The jury's still out on that as well. It's a lot of noise and not a lot of substance. So far, there's no evidence for a comprehensive plan. And certainly no, and by that I mean zero, accountability to the American people. Let's remember, the Pentagon just announced their plan to ask Congress for $200 billion to fund the war in Iran. They want the American taxpayers to sign off on borrowing, because we don't have the cash, to borrow $200 billion more money. $200 billion more. With that kind of money, we could fund universal pre-K in every state in this country. We could get to universal health care coverage. We could have free school meals for every child. We could free community college for every American for a full year. So when they shout out the importance of the SAVE Act, remember this one thing. It will not help you save a penny on your rent, your groceries, the cost of your health care. The only thing it's saving, I would argue, is their political skin. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Mr. President, I'd like to note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.